measure, or if you look at the current conditions and know what the critical frequency is, you can work out what the maximum usable frequency is, or vice versa. There's also something called the optimum working frequency, because the critical frequency, because the MUF, the maximum usable frequency, is just at this point where people skip, but sort of mostly skip, but start to penetrate. You want to operate below the maximum usable frequency, which is what we call the optimum working frequency. It's about 85% of the maximum usable frequency. So, again, lots of exam questions on this about the definition of critical frequency, optimal working frequency. I think there was a question like, where would you want to operate? And you want to operate at the optimal working frequency. Of course, all this assumes you could go anywhere on the HF band, but we're restricted to the amateur band, so you have to choose an amateur band which is below the optimal working frequency. Anything else to say on that? Oh, there's also the point, I guess, that Dave mentioned last time that there are a lot of beacons around, and we can listen to beacons to see whether the conditions are right to get skipped to wherever we want to communicate to. There's also a time signal called WWV that transmits on a number of well-defined frequencies. So it goes out on, remember here, 2.5, 5, 10, 15, and 20 megahertz. So you can tune to any of those and see, can you hear WWV? And if so, there's a WWV is in Colorado, and there's another one which is in Hawaii. Can you hear those stations? Okay, definition, critical frequency. Again, all this is important for the exam, knowing the definition of the critical frequency, which is directed vertically, and it's the point at which the radio wave is now penetrating out into space. Maximum usable frequency is where it's skipping, and if you go higher in frequency, it doesn't skip, it goes out into space, but it's going at an angle rather than vertically. Optimal working frequency is less than it's where you would want to operate, because you don't want to operate at the maximum usable frequency. There's also a lower usable frequency, which is the frequency at which you can penetrate the D layer in order to get up to the F layer. So there's actually a range of frequencies above the LUF up to the MUF that you can achieve skip. And this is just showing how, I guess, how we get skip at different angles. Yeah, so if we have signal going up on one frequency, bending the fraction, if we go to a higher frequency and take that same incident angle, it doesn't bend as much, it goes out into space. And then if you have waves on the same frequency going at different angles, it's going up vertically, it goes out into space, but as you bring the angle down, you can start to get a skip because it bends enough that it starts coming back down to the earth. Again, remembering the distances involved, but it's a bit short, but we should get about 4,000 kilometers on a F-layer skip, and that would be at 3 times the maximum usable frequency. the MUF would be at 3 times the critical frequency. All those are good things to know. Okay, so a lot of what we are interested in as amateurs is this F-layer skipping, because it does provide really long distance communication. But there are other effects that people like to use, experiment with. So the things like sporadic E, which is E-layer skipping. Under the right conditions, you can get that happening at VHF frequencies. People like to communicate with satellites or talk to people on the space station if there's an amateur on the space station. In order to do that, we have to operate at VHF because we want to penetrate the ionosphere, and that if it's at a lower frequency, it doesn't get out. At higher frequency, VHF and beyond, it goes straight out through those layers. What else have we got? Yeah, I think there's much to say about that. So there are also effects in what's called the troposphere. So the troposphere is where we are, where the weather is, and we can get effects where we've got a hot air layer, like a temperature inversion, and the density of the atmosphere is changing according to how hot or cold it is. So you can get basically refraction of the radio wave as it reaches this boundary between hot air and cooler air. And so if we've got an area of warm air here with cool air above and below it, we can get the radio signals or the radio waves bouncing just like they do off the ionosphere, but now they're bouncing off the different densities of the troposphere. And you can get pretty good long-distance communication up to about 800 kilometers on VHF using these effects called ducting, tropospheric ducting. Oh, there's my animation. There it goes. Auroras. Auroras are intense areas of ionized gases, and just like the F layer, you can bounce signals off the aurora, and some people like to do that. If you fire your, you probably have a Yagi. You point your Yagi from here. You point it north, hit the aurora, bounce it back, and communicate with people that way. If you were in the southern hemisphere, you point your antenna south. There is a question on the exam saying, if you want to use aurora, which way do you point your antenna? And of course, the aurora depends on the activity of the sun. So in intense parts of the sunspot cycle and solar storms, we can get very intense auroras. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention more towards VHF and UHF and look at how the radio waves propagate around locally. So locally we'll have things like hills, and we'll have what's called a concrete jungle here, urban areas with lots of buildings. And in these areas the radio waves are going to bounce off those objects. They'll bounce off the hills, and they'll bounce off the buildings and the cars and airplanes and anything else that's in the way. Typically in an urban setting, you don't get a direct wave. you don't have pure line of sight, but what you're actually receiving is a lot of reflected waves off multiple objects, and that is sort of shown on this next slide. So there's a car down there, and there's a base station somewhere over here. He's in the shadow of this building, but there's other things going on here. There's a refraction over the top of the building, there's a reflection over this building, and maybe another reflection there. And if you remember that when waves arrive going multiple paths, if they arrive in phase, they're going to add, and if they arrive out of phase, they're going to cancel each other out. As this vehicle moves around, it's going to go through places that have much higher signal strength than others. And this wasn't in the what I put out there, but I found some slides to illustrate this point. And this is actually from optics, where these are interference patterns, and there's some sort of object here that's scattering light, and it's interfering. As you get further away from the object, you get more of this effect of either adding or cancelling. But in a really cluttered environment, it will look like this. And again, this is optics. This is light intensity or lack of intensity on the light and dark areas. But what happens with radio is exactly the same. And so if you were operating at VHF in an urban setting, this is what signal strength would look like. You'd have some areas that were had high intensity, and other areas that were pretty dark, having low intensity. To the extent where the separation of these is of the order of a wavelength. So if you're operating at 2 meters, you could be standing here and have a perfectly good signal, and you could move here and have nothing because of that cancellation. When you're driving a vehicle and you're operating mobile, you'd often hear what we call flutter, where the signal will increase and decrease, and in fact what's happening is the background noise is increasing and decreasing as the vehicle drives along the road. Because what you're doing is you're driving through this intensity field of radio signals. Okay, so that's sort of an explanation of what happens. So this reflecting off object we call scatter, and in that urban setting you're getting scatter off multiple objects, all combining and either adding or cancelling. We've got E-layer skip, we talked about that quite a bit. People also like to use these exotic methods of communication, like Earth-Moon-Earth bounce. So we've got this moon that's in the sky, everybody can see, and what they'll have is a very focused high-gain Yagi. They'll point it at the moon, and they'll fire the VHF signal up to the moon. It will bounce off the moon, go back to the Earth, and try and talk to people that way. It's somewhat specialized, and I guess you need a lot of gear to be able to do that. Okay, so scatter. I mentioned scatter a little bit already. So scatter is really where we're bouncing off objects. Talk about the urban setting where we bounce off buildings and cars and things down there, but there could be objects in the atmosphere. So these might be, potentially these could be physical objects like aircraft, or they could be weather objects like snow, hail, rain. They could be pockets of gas. So in the atmosphere, you could have pockets of ionized gas and get scatter off that. So anything